Now we're going to move forward. All right, thank you. We need to continue. Thank you. We are going to continue now with Michael Rosenfeld about a potential attack against the U.S. Gas stations. Go for it. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me in the back? Is this good back there? Awesome, sweet. Well, like Rod said, my name is Michael Rosenfeld. This is actually the first conference that I've ever spoken at, and I can't think of a better place than Miami to do it. So yeah, with that, let's talk about hacking America's gas stations, specifically a device that's known as an automated tank gauge. A little bit of background on me. I started in the industrial control system cybersecurity realm. I was kind of thrown into that. If you don't know anything about ICS or SCADA cybersecurity, it's an absolute nightmare. It's riddled with vulnerabilities, legacy systems, and just like an ultimate lack of security principles all around, which is kind of terrifying because that includes the power grid, oil companies, you know what I mean? We talk about Colonial Pipeline, a lot of things fall into that sector. And a lot of times, right, on the IT side of the house, we are ingrained with this idea of the CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. On the ICS side of the house, a lot of times people will say, oh, it's availability first. And I kind of disagree with that model. I think what it really comes down to when we're talking about ICS and SCADA systems is that it comes down to safety, reliability, and productivity. Those are kind of the three main core components to it. And what I'm talking on today is actually going to kind of focus on the latter of those two. Now I'm a red teamer, so I like to break things. When I am not red teaming, I like reading about other people that break things, and that's where the security research comes in. I like reading a lot of those articles. And if you guys are interested in what I talked about today, feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn or GitHub. If you did not like what I talked about today, feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn or GitHub, and we'll keep rolling here. But anyway, where did this all begin? How did I get into gas station hacking? How did I get into automated tank gauges? And it really goes back to one night I was reading an article by H.D. Moore, who, if you're not familiar with, he was the creator of the Metasploit framework and a bunch of other awesome projects. But he had released this article in 2015 saying, hey guys, there are these fuel monitoring devices that are vulnerable and they're connected to the internet. And we'll talk about what that really looks like. And so he's like, there's 5,800 of these devices that are out there. And so I started digging further into it. I'm like, this is 2021, 2022 time frame. I'm bored during the pandemic. I'm like, all right, what does the attack surface look like 7 years later? And so that's really what I want to talk about today. This research kind of led me into a GitHub repository by Jake Jarvis, known as Awesome Shodan Queries. And he was running one that specifically looked for gas station pump controllers, looking at intake inventory requests on port 10,001. So that's kind of where this all started for me. And it took me to this device. This device is known as an automated tank gauge, or an ATG. And its primary function that it serves is that it just monitors fuel levels, basically, right? If there's a leakage, it'll tell you that. Let's say that you're a gas station and you have unleaded diesel, right? You have a couple of different tanks that have liquids within it. It will report back to you and tell you some of that information. It's primarily manufactured by Veeder-Root, and there's a couple of different models that I'll talk a little bit about today. If I say TLS 300, 350, or TLS 450, that's what the device looks like, basically. But, right, besides its primary function being able to monitor leakage and fuel levels, it can also do a ton of other things, whether that's system resets, whether it's alarms, whether it's generating different reports. It has a ton of functionality. And when I mean a ton, this is a Veeder-Root TLS 300, 350, basically it's a manual, and these are the function codes that the device can perform. And this is just a quick scroll through. This isn't even all of them. It can perform over 600 different function codes. So you're like, okay, why does this even matter, right? Like, cool, it's a device that like does a bunch of stuff, awesome. When it comes to remote monitoring of these devices, and if you go to Vitaroot's website, right, they recommend all of these awesome cybersecurity principles. They're like, hey, if you want to remotely monitor this, if you want to hit it from a phone, if you want to hit it from a computer system to make sure that you know the levels that are in your tanks, you want to make sure that you have a security appliance in front of it, whether that be a firewall. You want to make sure that you're accessing it securely using SSH, right? A lot of these great principles that are, that we recommend throughout the field. But when it comes down to it, and the sad reality of how these devices are configured, operators will generally just take the Ethernet cable, they'll configure it so that they can do remote monitoring over TCP port 10,001, and then they'll just connect it directly to the router going out to the internet. The scary, and this is what I think is the scary part, it is generally a plain text connection. You can connect to it using Telnet, and you can just issue one of those 600 function codes to the device with zero authentication, and the device will do that. And so here is just a simple example. Hopefully this lets me like click in here. So here's just an example. Connecting to the device on 10,001, you can see that it's connected, and then I can begin issuing the function code. That is basically an intake inventory request. So I'm saying to the device, hey, tell me what's in your tanks. And we can see here there are 4 different tanks, right? Super, unleaded diesel, AdBlue, and then it gives some more information on that. This is actually a HONEYPOT, which I'll talk about a little bit later in it. But just an idea how easy this is. And so when I first saw this, I'm like, shoot, this is just an intake inventory request. What if I used one of those other 600 functions? What if, right, those 5,800 devices that H.D. Moore saw in 2015, what if I sent system resets to all of those at the same time? What would that really look like? And so I'm looking at this, and I'm like, okay, that's an intake inventory request. I wonder what the worst possible thing that hackers could do to it. And I started thinking, I'm like, okay, Vitaroot probably knows these devices a lot better than I do, because I'm not a control systems engineer by any chance, and I didn't design the device. So if you go and you look at the security page by Vitaroot, I just want to highlight 3 here. One thing that they noted is an attacker could log in and they could change the name of the tank to something inappropriate. I was like, that's kind of cute. And it was actually, documented that that happened twice in history. Once was by the anonymous hacking group, and they renamed the tank We Are Legion. And then another time was by some Iranian threat actor. Another one, and I think this is a little bit more dangerous, would be to make the tank look like it's larger than it actually is, so that when they go, to fill it with fuel or whatever you're going to put in it, that it would overflow, causing an environmental leak. I'm like, okay, that's even worse. And then I like to jump down to number 5, which is shutting down the networking services and the IP cards, which if you read this line right here, it says, you could change the configurations, rendering the management systems ineffective. Critical operations could be impacted, aka hospitals, emergency providers, cell service, and power plants. I'm like, kind of terrifying. So I thought, this looks pretty bad. It looks pretty bad right now. It's 2022. H.D. Moore said there's 5,800 of these devices in 2015, right? I wonder what that attack surface looks like today. And so the data that I'm going to present on is actually as recent as last month, because I wanted to make sure it was as updated as possible to you. Don't freak out when you see this number. 26,000. This is right, my first stop, of course, is going to Shodan, just to get an idea of what it looks like. But if you look here, for some reason, and I think there's going to be a lot more talks coming up on this, in April of 2023, China's Education and Research Network decided to deploy 20,000 industrial control system honeypots. Don't know why. And then they are continuing to deploy them. So it's actually up to like 50,000 right now. So if you check that number again, I don't know how they have this massive honeypot network, but it's pretty impressive. So hopefully somebody gives a talk on that in the future. But you can see, right, disregarding this crazy spike over here, from 2017 through, Shodan consistently sees 5,600 devices to like generally between like 5,000 and 6,000 devices. If we look at the exposure levels within the U.S., this is just a nice little chart from Shodan showing the ATG exposure levels, and you can see that the United States is like the #1 for a long time until China just decided to go wild with it. And then you can see some of the exposure points within the U.S. for these devices. So I thought, okay, Shodan is a really awesome tool. I love it. It makes a lot of this querying and searching really easy. How can I validate these results for myself to actually know for a fact that these devices are out on the internet and that they're I can't even talk. They're susceptible to this kind of attack. So I developed this plan. This is what my plan was. I was going to scan the entire internet for port 10,001 just to see what devices are listening on it. Right? It could be somebody running another service on that port. You might get an open SSH banner, blah, blah, blah. I just wanted to narrow it down. From there, I wanted to create this Python script, because I like Python, that would go out and it would actually query the device. It would run a get intake inventory request, and then if the data that was returned, if that response that came back was legitimate, then I would basically say, hey, here's an ATG, log the IP address, count the devices, and then write about the results. So I did this during the pandemic, and I blame my pandemic brain on this one, but I ran it from a Raspberry Pi, which is not a great idea when it comes to resources. I don't know whose idea that was to scan the entire internet from a Raspberry Pi.
Wing it.
Yeah, I was just going for it. And so what I did was I ran it, discovered 85,000 devices that were utilizing TCP port 10,001, discovered some ATGs that were listening, and here's just like a simple 25-line Python script that I use, basically just generating that intake inventory request, and then after that it would just search the response and say, hey, if intake inventory is within that response, count it. And then of course, right, like I said before, the final step, write about the results of it and get famous on Reddit, which didn't go too hot. I didn't get fully Reddit famous, but I came up with a pretty cool clickbait title, and it was how a script kiddie and 25 lines of Python code could devastate America's gas stations. And so I released this article just with my limited research that I did. And I was like, okay, cool, we're good to go. Throw the numbers out there. Hopefully somebody, raises awareness or whatever. And I get a response from a Stephen Hilt. And he says, how many are gas pot or con pot? And I'm like, first of all, who the heck is Stephen Hilt? And second of all, what's a gas pot? Well, Stephen Hilt actually wrote Gaspot, which is a Python honeypot designed to mimic an ATG device. What it does is it has this configuration file that it references. So you can see over here, right, there'll be 4 different products within it. Listens on TCP port 10,001, and then it'll send that information back and try to randomize it to make it look like it's a legitimate device. And so I'm like, shoot, I just put out all of this research, all this information, and I don't know how many of them are honeypots, right? I don't want to just totally drop a bomb and then be like, okay, sorry. So I had to go back to the drawing board. I had to come up with a new plan. And my new plan was this. I had learned from the first time, from the couple of mistakes that I made, that I wanted to do it differently this time. I was going to keep it the same when it came to scanning the internet. I was going to scan for TCP port 10,001, Then instead of Python, because I realized Python's really easy to write and really slow to execute, I wanted to use Go or Golang to accomplish the same thing, kind of expedite that execution. And then basically now, this is where the pivotal part between the first time and the second time, if the device responded with ATG data, I wanted to capture that response so that I could analyze it and be like, okay, is this a gas pot or is this a legitimate device? And so from that, I wanted to count the legitimate devices and the honeypots that responded, and then here we are today presenting the results, so I can finally say that Plan B was accomplished. So I'm going to talk about kind of going through this plan, and I'm going to be completely open and vulnerable about my processes, how I did things, and tips and recommendations if you want to conduct similar research on different devices, what I learned from it. So when it came to scanning the internet, right, I used mass scan, and I learned from the first time that Raspberry Pis are not the best platform to run it from. And I did a lot of testing, whether that be just a virtual machine, whether that be like a physical host on a network, whether that be like a cloud provider virtual machine, and then tried to find the perfect balance of packets. One reason, right, you think of a port scanner, kind of going back to the whole mass scan thing, when you think of a port scanner, generally you think of Nmap, right? You can't efficiently Nmap the entire internet just because of how Nmap works, right? Like, let's say that I wanted to Nmap the entire internet. It would go through, it would scan, it would send a TCP SYN, SYNAC, and we'll say it's a connect scan, and then an ACK back, right? And then it would move on to that next address within the subnet. Mass scan does it a little bit differently. It opens up two different channels. It says transmission channel, reception channel. The transmission channel, it just goes SYN, 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 right? And then the reception channel just waits for those SYNACs to come back. Then it counts the devices. That's what makes it so much more efficient. Mass scan, with like some fine tuning and stuff, you can actually scan the entire internet in like 5 to 6 minutes. So it's pretty crazy. The issue with it is, right, Nmap is going to be a little bit more accurate. So finding that that balance between efficiency and accuracy, because you just want to make sure that you have both of those. And so after running the scan, I found 858,000 devices that were utilizing TCP 10,001, which kind of corresponded with Shodan's results for that. So I'm like, okay, I know I'm on the right path here. When it comes to tips for scanning the internet, like I said, don't use a Raspberry Pi. Utilize a cloud provider, right? Your ISP might not like you sending billions of packets. And then make use of mass scan features. One that I love is that you can actually just use a configuration file with the TAC-C option. And so what I'm doing down here is I'm basically sending 100,000 packets per second. That takes a little bit of fine tuning. You can send up to like 2 million packets per second if you use a special Linux driver that just like magically does stuff in the kernel for you. But then of course, if you don't have the network or something to that effect, you might drop packets, you might miss out on something. And then you can specify like your output format. So I like XML. It's easy to parse, it's easy to kind of work with. So you can specify a couple of different things. And then the exclude file, that one's really important because there are some sensitive networks out there that you really don't want to get on their list if you scan them. Massscan has a exclude file within their GitHub repo that you can utilize for that, where they're like, hey, over the years, these are the people that reached out to us, like, hey, don't scan our networks. So here you can see just running massscan, running that massscan config. It still says it's going to take about like 11 hours-ish, but you can kind of like fine tune that and work with it as well. So now on to the next part of the plan. This was generating in-tank inventory requests. I learned the first time, Python's quick to write. You can write a script up 10, 15 minutes. Now with ChatGPT, right? It seems like it's a lot faster. But it takes forever to execute. That first script that that I created takes 452 hours, right? If an attacker, instead of doing an intake inventory and say they want to do like a system reset and they use that script for it, it would take forever. It would take 452 hours to send that across the entire internet. So I definitely recommend, if you haven't used Golang or Go, it's a great language. It's really great with networking. I consider it kind of like a happy, I don't know if I'd call it like a happy medium between C and Python when it comes to like some of the language and the syntax to it. But it has a couple of really cool features. It's great with networking. And when it comes to portability, you can cross-compile. And it also does static linking. So, you know, in a Python program, if you just pull somebody's GitHub project down and you run it and it's like, oh, there's no module named TQDM, and then you have to do like a pip install on that. With Golang, when you compile the binaries, it compiles all of the dependencies into it. So you'll end up with like very large files sometimes, but it has everything kind of built into it, which is pretty nice. So we have that. Concurrency. Golang makes use of Go routines, which are like lightweight multi-threads, which is really nice as well, so that can kind of like speed up that process for you. When it comes to outputting the results for analysis, this is something that I really enjoy. I like doing analysis for some reason. I don't know where I got that from, but there's a couple of different options that you can utilize, and there's tons of different ways that you can do it. When I wrote the script to go out, query the device, and then pull that intake inventory response back, what I did was, for one trial run, I basically outputted it to JSON so that I could see the response and then the IP address. I could ingest that into Splunk or whatever analytic platform that you want to utilize, and then you can run some queries in there just to make your searching a little bit easier. Another way that I also like to use, coming from like the Linux world, is if you name it with a standard naming convention, you can use some bash command line kung fu to search through it. So what I'm doing down here is basically saying, hey, when the device responded, I outputted the response to a file that was called the results underscore and then the IP address of that device. So basically what I'm saying here is, for a file in results, do this crazy grep command to find that default config, like the products, the 4 products that were listed. So I was like, find super, unlead, diesel, and AdBlue that are over like multi-line. That's basically what that's saying. And then echo HONEYPOT and then the file name. So you can do it that way too. There's a ton of different ways of doing that kind of stuff. But so now we're at the point, we scan the internet, we have our responses, we have them formatted how we want them formatted. How do we determine what's a gas pod, what's a honeypot, and what's a legitimate device? And it really comes down to the nature of these devices. Like I said earlier, there is a default config that you can run, and if you think about it from the process of somebody who's deploying this, right? If you are China and you want to scalably deploy these, you might not make a lot of moderations to the configuration file. So I wanted to basically go in and see how many were using the default configuration. A lot of them will also have unusual behavior. This would be, let's say that you went in, you ran, you generated an intake inventory request for a device one day, you went back and you ran it 3 days later, and the values hadn't changed at all. Like none of the tank levels have gone down. That's not very characteristic of that device, right? Because let's say it's a gas station that's in Miami, and you're like, hey, how come they haven't sold any gas in 3 days? So you can do some comparative analysis in that sense. And then another one would be lack of protocol support. I actually reached out to Stephen Hilt, and I said, hey man, hypothetically speaking, if you were going to determine which ones were legitimate and which ones were gas pots, how would you do it? And he said, within gas pot, I only wrote 5 functions into it. It can only respond to 5 of those 600 function codes. If you send a response and you're expecting a legitimate response from that device and you get what I coded in there, then you'll know. So that's another way to delineate. So now we get down to how many gas pots are actually out there. And I can tell you, as of April, there are 1,760, and that changes. And these numbers, honestly, since China deployed like 50,000 of these, this is kind of irrelevant. This is prior to that deployment. So before that, the interesting data that I found was like a majority of those were using the default configurations. People didn't take the time to go in and actually understand what that config looked like and to actually change it up, which was interesting. And then a good amount of them are deployed within the cloud. That's like a dead giveaway because I don't think Vita Root came out with a virtual ATG. And then, yep, China's Education and Research Network deploys a majority. Now we get down to 2023. How many legitimate ATGs are connected to the internet with no password protection and can still be accessed? And that number is 3,565. 91% are located in the US. That's just a little chart up there. And then the city of Chicago has the most with 107. Miami has 50. And last time I checked, which was like 3 days ago, the closest one is like maybe 2 miles from here. I don't know.
Nice.
So when we say like a devastating attack, 3,500 of all of the gas stations in America, I mean, might not be like a huge dent, but if 50 gas stations go down in Miami, like I think that's going to make the news. So, what can be done? As cybersecurity professionals, what H.D. Moore was saying in 2015, he was saying, hey guys, we have this issue, we have 5,800 of these devices that are connected to the internet. I think we need to raise awareness and we need to educate people on what these devices actually are, what they can actually do, and then from there, we need to work with the operators and the people that are actually implementing and integrating these technologies to make sure that they're more secure. There are going to be so many more attack vectors into these devices. Like I was just looking at it a couple of days ago. The newest version, software version of the ATG that is coming out has a web interface with it, right? So you don't even have to go in and dig into all like the manuals and look up all the serial codes and all of that good stuff. There's a nice graphical user interface that you can go in and be like, shut off. And they said, hey, our default account is going to be guest, and the default password is going to be the serial number of the CPU. You can go into the serial, into the function code manual, you can look at it, and it'll be like, show me the serial, the serial number of the CPU, and it'll give that to you. So if you want to log in from a web application, that's a good way to do it. And that's in the newest version that's coming out. From a system owner perspective, I think this is one of the hardest parts when it comes to ICS cybersecurity. It's like talking to the IT people and then talking to the boots on the ground, like operators and people that are doing the day-to-day. It's essential to put a security appliance in front of this device and to use encrypted data, like using SSH rather than Telnet to interact with this device. And then you can also reassign default ports. That's kind of like that obscurity or security by obscurity principle. But that's, yeah, I would say probably the biggest one here is to utilize a security appliance in front of it, for sure. And yeah, I think that's about all I got. Does anybody have any questions? I know like I'm probably like 10 minutes early right now, but if anybody has any questions, feel free. Yes, sir.
When you first read the documentation, right, about these devices, did it seem intentional that they wanted to leave it open instead of applying security?
Oh,
I know they're sort of IoT devices,
yeah,
right? And those tend to not have security.
that's true. I don't know. And I always have that debate when it comes to ICS stuff because I'm like, is it just poor implementation or is it intended by design. So I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question.
What's the company weak?
Vita Root.
Vita Root.
Yeah,
right.
Vita Root.
What do they say? What's their take on all this?
All of this, and it really goes back to, sorry if I make anybody
They
dizzy.
don't produce the gateways, right? Like they don't produce the serial to like TCP bridges. So that's on the person installing.
It's on the person, and that's
Oh,
what it goes back to.
basically their take.
This is
If you
what they're
didn't
saying.
deploy it the way we said.
Yep, exactly. And so that's where you get like the system operators that go out and they're just like, okay, we want to remotely monitor it. Like I want an email every time our diesel gets low so that we can put in a shipment. They'll just plug it in.
These bridges.
So,
Yeah.
quick one.
Yes.
Your question or your numbers. So the 3,000 is the actual reality number. Whether it could be a lot more, they're actually implementing it correctly. Those are just the numbers that aren't.
Those are just the numbers of no password protection on the device, and so it's just like straight out there. I can just, like with that Telnet connection, just dial in straight to it. Yes, sir, Alderman.
So you briefing these teams and IT guys, security guys, are they like just like deer in the headlights, or they just have like a financial like to upgrade?
Yeah, I think sadly on the ICS side of the house, right? They're not cybersecurity experts by any means, right? Their whole intent is, hey, I just need to get the system functional, and then my hands are up, right? So when you show them something like this, they're like, their first instinct is, if I put a security appliance in front of it, is that going to mess something up?
Yeah.
You know? Sorry.
Are any of these devices vulnerable to DDoS?
Yeah, I mean, so there's like, there's an Nmap script, there's a Metasploit module, right? Just this simple, wherever it may be, right? Just this simple script alone, instead of this function code right here being an intake inventory request, if I just went into the manual, looked it up and said system reset, right? And just threw that in there and then sprayed it, it would just reset the system. Wow. Yeah.
So I have a funny anecdote on that. So my educational background is chemical engineering, and before switching to cyber, I was actually interviewing for a controls engineer position, and I brought up the fact that I was studying for CompTIA Security Plus, and he's like, "Oh, that's not relevant. Where are our gaps?"
That's their usual answer.
Yes, sir.
And to follow on to that, if the only known exploit has been to change the name of the tank, you're not going to get operators to invest in security. Has there been anything other than changing the name of the?
Well, I guess also the real question is like, is there visibility to see if somebody actually did something?
Yeah.
You know, I know I want to say it was like maybe 2015 or 2016 timeframe. Trend Micro did a report on this. Stephen Hill, who works for them, he actually deployed them all over the place, and he tried to make them look as legitimate as possible, like changed up the configs and stuff. And that's how he got a lot of that data and saw what attackers were actually doing. But I don't know any other researchers who have implemented it to that extent.
You said this is your first presentation?
Yes, sir.
Would you consider giving this presentation to Veer?
I've
Open up their eyes a little.
Yeah, I feel the hard part is I don't know.
Might have an accident the next day.
The hard part is like they put the recommendations out there.
Doused in gas.
You know what I mean? Who's the operator that's actually implementing it and then plugging it in? You know, it's hard. Like who do we go to for this?
Isn't it
It's got to
an
be an installation
integrator?
company or
That's-
something?
that's the
And they're
thing.
probably doing the same thing. Like I don't know how old these things are, like whether they've been successive models done, but they've probably been doing something similar for like the last 20 years. And so they're just like, we'll stick a serial bridge on this, and that's how in the Crimean War, like they took a bunch of like Ukrainian power stations out that way because they're using these control bridges. But I have also heard that some of the pump systems are susceptible to IR attacks. Like they have a little IR thing on it. You can change the price of the gas and things like that.
Does that device control the pricing of the gas as well, or is that?
No, it's mostly mostly the monitoring of the fuel, and then you can do like a lot of different reports and alarms.
Oh,
I have an electric car.
So they have 600 codes just to monitor the level of the fuel?
Control systems are wild. Like I don't understand what all of the things do, but I don't know. Yeah, a lot of stuff. Yes, sir.
Are you going to repost to Reddit?
Oh gosh, I don't. If you saw in the, it says deleted. Like I don't even have Reddit anymore. This is perfect.
Does the manual have a command for purge?
Purge. I think that would be like the equivalent of like system reset. Is that what you mean, or like
So
something?
they literally like dump, or they discharge, like like some of these gas like pumps. And
Yeah.
stations, like they have like a purge or something. Like, if I need, if there's just water or something in there. Like,
Yeah.
to purge it out. Is there a command? Like you can say, well, understand is like, okay, I want to tell this pump to purge.
Mm-hmm.
So
There probably is a lot of them. A lot of it is like alarms, if that makes sense. Like a lot of it will be like, hey, just alarm the operator that there's something occurring here.
So this is a two-part question.
Oh.
Well, the first part is, using that code, could you trick or reprogram the supply, the vault, as it's showing that it's full when it's not?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so if that's possible, couldn't somebody who's delivering the gas and they're a clever hacker say that it's full and then take the gas and go put it in a warehouse?
Does it have a code to like maybe update the firmware of these devices or anything like that that you can take over?
Private documented.
You can take over each device and the firmware.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was like some of the more recent stuff that I saw was like security panel stuff. So if they have like a web app on it, you can basically log into it and be like disable the security, and then disable it, and then you can just log in through the web app and just click whatever you want. Love that. Love doing it.
So it's kind of what he said, talk about the company, since nobody listens anyways, maybe the company in their email reports that they email these morons, they can actually say, hey, are you securing your facility? Something, at least to that extent, maybe they can do that.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what you said before with the installation companies. Like, I'm not sure, like, who do you go to?
Well, I'm saying the manufacturer. The manufacturer controls for firmware and the one who updated the firmware. In that report, it actually will say, hey, by the way, are you securing your installation? Something that's true.
Did you see if there was a specific chain that had more vulnerable ones, or is it kind of
Everything.
spread everyone?
Yeah, it's kind of
so it just
everything.
depends.
A lot of them, and I mean, this is going to be kind of sad, but a lot of them are like out in the middle of nowhere kind of things, like middle of Texas, you know, just kind of doing its own
Along the
thing. Middle of
interstate.
Tennessee. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
How did you pinpoint that, like a specific location of a gas station? Like if you have their IP, you can tell what city they're in.
General.
Did you just use deductive reasoning, or?
No,
how did you make
actually, a lot of so the intake inventory report, a legitimate device will respond more likely than not with the actual address. So it'll be like a great example. Yeah.
I'm here.
Yeah. There's one like right next to my house, and it'll be like Crown, you know, and it'll be like this highway, this location. It's pretty interesting. That's how I found the one at the end here.
So dusting is a feature, not a bond.
What is that?
Dusting is a feature, not a bond.
Yeah. One more question? Sorry, go for it.
When you were scanning and then
Wow, that's right there.
when you were scanning and maybe logging into these or punching in some codes, did you notice in the documentation at least if they log these attempts, and did you use anything VPN protection?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely. A lot of it I did from like a cloud provider and stuff like that.
And
So
the gas station too.
Yeah.
So what other ports are open on that gas station?
That's the weird part with a lot of, you know how I said at the beginning, and there's that picture of the TLS 450. The sad part is there'll be SSH open on it, there'll be a web server, and then there'll be port 10,001. So it's like you can still access it over SSH, but that port 10,001 is still open.
They can probably just
So
config or something, right? Like, so whatever bridge they're using, they can probably disable the telnet. It's just the configuration. They're not doing it if it has those.
yeah.
It's just that there's a sort of web server on there.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of them. Last question, go for it.
Could these devices be reconfigured to have like a botnet with certain commands to intake?
So I guess, how would you do it? Crypto mine? Like, I don't know if I could write something
let's say,
to, you know?
instead of like doing like with the commands like from the main, like you actually be able to interact with it and be able to take in like new commands and such.
Maybe that would go way beyond anything that I did with this. So yeah, that's, hey, if you want to pick it up as a project, that's all you. That's all you. But yeah.
So you also saw port 22 open. Did you notice any unique SSH fingerprints that could identify with other ATGs?
I think it's just like open SSH is what it's utilizing. But yeah, I think, and this is something that I actually want to work with Stephen Hilt on in the future, is making GasPod like have some of those features. Like, hey, can we actually deploy a legitimate looking web server on it and capture what attackers are doing to it on that front? And can we deploy SSH, see like what different vectors attackers are doing? So maybe we could kind of rework this into like a 2023, 2024 research edition. But if nobody has any more questions, thank you again for your time.